Hello and welcome to our Learning and Work Institute webinar on adult participation in learning, which we're running as part of our work as the UK's national coordinator for the European Agenda on Adult Learning. My name is Emily Jones and I'm Head of Research at Learning and Work Institute, and I'm joined by two colleagues, Sophie Hall and Abigail Legoo, who will be presenting our research. We'll be sharing key findings on adult participation in learning in the UK, but we'd like to place them in a broader context of trends in other European countries. So to share their perspectives, we have three contributors who will take part in a panel discussion at the end of the session. So we have Professor Ellen Burren from the University of Glasgow, Derval Lawless, Head of Advocacy at AINTHUS, and Uwe Gartenschläger, President of EAEA. So thank you very much all for joining us. So we'll begin with some findings from this year's Adult Participation in Learning survey. This will be followed by findings from qualitative research on adults' experiences of learning in lockdown, and then we'll finish with our panel discussion. The Adult Participation in Learning survey provides a unique overview of the level of participation in learning by adults, with a detailed breakdown of who participates and who doesn't. This is the 25th year of our Adult Participation in Learning survey. Since 1996, we've run the survey on an almost annual basis, so we're able to look at each year individually, but also compare findings to longer-term trends. The survey deliberately adopts a broad definition of learning, including a wide range of formal, non-formal and informal learning, much wider than publicly funded provision. Each year, a representative sample of approximately 5,000 adults aged 17 and over across the UK are provided with this definition of learning and asked when they last took part. Historically, the survey has been conducted by a market research company face-to-face. Last year, this wasn't possible due to the pandemic, and the survey was conducted via telephone, and the results are not directly comparable. This year, the survey has been conducted online. It is more comparable to when we look at previous years, but while we've done checks on the consistency of the results, we have to apply some caution when directly comparing to previous years. We intend to stick with an online approach, so the 2021 survey will provide a baseline for future years. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Sophie, who's going to talk us through the findings from this year's survey.
Thanks, Emily. So I'll just take you through some of the key findings from the survey now. And just to note, these are just headlines. So we have a report published on our website where you can see the findings in a lot more detail and kind of breakdowns of different demographic groups as well. So the first question we always ask every year of the survey is when adults most recently took part in learning. And we can see from this year's results that a quarter of adults from the survey are currently learning. 2 in 10 have learned in the last 3 years, and then around a quarter, so 26%, said that they haven't taken part in learning since leaving full-time education. The same proportion, so 26%, also said that they have taken part in learning, but they haven't done so in the last 3 years. So throughout the survey, I'll be talking about the participation rate, and this is basically anybody who's taken part in learning within the last 3 years, either currently or recently, and our participation rate for this year is 44%. So this chart just shows our participation rate for the survey every year since 1996. Just to note, there are some blanks and there are a few years where we didn't do the survey. And as Emily mentioned as well, we aren't comparing to the findings for 2020 because of the context of the pandemic and the change in methods. But what we can really see from this chart is that up until around 2017, we had a fairly consistent participation rate of around 2 in 5, around 40%. There were some peaks, sometimes it was higher, but it was relatively consistent. It then declined to 37% in 2017. It declined again to 35% in 2018, and again to just a third in 2019. So this was by far our lowest participation rate in the history of the survey. This year, as we've already mentioned, it has increased quite substantially to 44%. We do need to consider that there might be some impact of a change to an online method. For example, it can be that people who are more digitally engaged are also more likely to take part in learning. We also think that there could be a direct influence of the ongoing pandemic as people are starting to reflect on their careers and their career goals. It could also be that because we've adopted this broad definition, people are learning for leisure, thinking about new hobbies and interests throughout the lockdown as well, and that's contributed to this increase. So if we're thinking about engaging more adults in learning, we also need to understand which groups are most and least likely to learn. So each year when we do our survey, we also break these findings down by various social groups, and I'll just take you through some of those key findings in the next few slides. If we start with age, we can see that age has a really direct correlation with participation in learning. So each year we find that the younger respondents are, the more likely they are to have engaged in learning in the last 3 years. This year, we found that 85% of 17 to 19-year-olds have taken part in learning in the last 3 years. This declines to just half of adults aged 35 to 44. It declines again to 40% of adults aged 45 to 54, and just a third of adults aged 55 to 64. So if we're thinking about the context of our, longer working lives, the fact that people are more likely to need to change their jobs or change their careers, we really need to start considering how we can engage adults with learning throughout their working lives and throughout their careers. We also broke these findings down by social grades. So just to briefly explain the social grades we've used here. Grade A is basically the upper classes and the upper middle class, and this is normally grouped with grade B, which is the middle class. We then have grade C1, which is basically the kind of white collar professional middle class. C2 is skilled manual workers, and then grade D would be semi-skilled and unskilled manual workers, and grade E would be lower grade professions or unemployed, and grades D and E are normally grouped together as well. So we can see from this slide that those in kind of higher social grades are more likely to take part in learning. Over half of those in the A and B grades have taken part in learning in the last 3 years, compared to just over a third of those in the D and E grades. And if we look at the purple bar, we can also see that those in the D and E grades are twice as likely to say that they haven't taken part in learning since leaving full-time education when compared to those in the A and B grades. When we compare to findings from previous years, we do notice a similar pattern in that it is people from higher social grades who are more likely to take part in learning. When compared to 2019, participation rates for all groups have either maintained or been increased. But because they've increased across all groups, we haven't actually seen any reduction at all in the disparity between these groups. So we also broke these findings down by working status, and we can see from the chart that people with closer proximity to the labour market are more likely to take part in learning. And again, this is very consistent with what we found in previous years. So over half of adults who are working full-time or part-time say that they've taken part in learning within the last 3 years. This declines to just 45% of those who are unemployed and seeking work, 28% of those who are unable to work or disabled, and just 1 in 5 of retired respondents. So again, there are some similarities to previous years in that those closer to the labour market are more likely to take part. We have again seen an increase since 2019 across all categories of working status, but the increase has been highest for those who are employed. So again, we're seeing a pattern where those who are already more likely to learn are seeing the largest increases, and so disparities between groups aren't reducing as a result. We also broke these findings down by age that people left full-time education. And again, we can see a strong association here with participation in learning. So people who stayed in education until at least the age of 21 are twice as likely to say that they've learned within the last 3 years when compared to those who left education age 16 or under. When compared to the findings for 2019, we see the same pattern where participation has increased for all groups, but the biggest increase was for those who left education aged 19 to 20. The smallest increase was for those who left education aged 16 or under. So to summarise the findings for this section, we've seen an increase in participation across all social groups. However, disparities between groups have remained either stable or they've actually increased. Moving on now to future intentions to learn. Each year in the survey, we also ask adults whether they intend to take up learning in the next 3 years. And we can see from this slide that 4 in 10 adults, so 41%, said that they would like to take up learning in the next 3 years. And just under half, so 48%, said that they don't intend to take up learning in the next 3 years. And we also broke these findings down by how recently adults have taken part in learning. And we can see an almost mirror image here. So 8 in 10 current learners said that they would like to take up learning again within the next 3 years. And 2/3 of people who learned within the last 3 years said that they are likely to take up learning again in the future. Then when we look at people who haven't learned since leaving full-time education, we can see that 8 in 10 say they would they'd be unlikely to do so again in the future. So in order to increase participation in learning, particularly when we look at these groups who are further away from learning, we need to understand adults' motivations to learn and also any barriers they may experience. So every year we ask adults the reason they took up their main learning. We ask them whether it was mainly for work or career related reasons, or whether it was for leisure or personal interest. And the pie chart on the left shows our results for this year. So we found that just over half of learners took part in learning for work or career related reasons, while 44% said that they learned for leisure or personal interest. This is a large increase from 2019. Where just 2 in 10 learners said that they took part in learning for leisure or personal interest, and the rest said they took part in learning for work or their career. And the findings of previous years were also around 20%. So we think this could be a result of the pandemic again. It could be that people are just developing new hobbies and new interests as a result of the kind of lockdown restrictions. We also need to consider there might be a slight impact from a change in survey method. We also ask adults about their broader motivations for learning, which is shown on the table on the right-hand side of the slide. And what we can see is actually learners are saying the main reasons they take up learning are for personal development or for subject interest. So 40% of adults this year said they took up their learning because they were interested in the subject. 36% said that this was to develop themselves as a person. Work-related reasons were also still important. So just over a quarter said they wanted to do their current job better or improve their job skills. And other important motivating factors were getting a recognised qualification, improving self-confidence and improving well-being. So I think this just really demonstrates that actually there are a really broad range of motivations for learning. It's not just that people want to develop skills for work, it's also very much about personal development and personal achievement as well. And this is something that we need to consider when we're trying to promote learning, how we can tap into this really broad range of motivations. So we also ask adults about how they take part in their learning, and the main reason we do this is to just get some insights into where they're accessing their learning from. This year we found that 1/3 of learners, so 34%, said that they'd taken part in learning independently on their own. And then this was followed by 16% who had learned through a university or AG institution, 15% who had learned on a training course at work, and 14% who'd learned on the job. In terms of the order of the findings, it's pretty similar to previous years, but we have found quite a substantial increase in people who are learning independently. So this figure was just 16% in 2019 and 21% in 2018. Again, this could be the impact of the pandemic, firstly because we have had lockdown restrictions, but also we've seen this increase in people who are learning for leisure, and this might be something that they choose to pursue independently. We also, for the last few years, have been asking about online learning just to kind of monitor trends in this as well. And this year we found that 7 in 10 learners, so 69%, said that at least some of their learning had taken place online. For over half of the learners, this had been fully online, and for 16%, this had been a mix of online and face-to-face learning. And this is quite a large increase from 47% in 2019. So I think this really just reflects the acceleration of online learning as a result of the pandemic. 3 in 10 adults who took part in learning said that they did so face-to-face. And when we broke down the findings, we actually found that people who are currently learning were more likely to be learning face-to-face when compared to those who had learned in the last 3 years. It was about it was a slight difference. So we can kind of see that there has perhaps been a gradual return of face-to-face learning as the lockdown restrictions have eased, but it's clear that online learning is still quite prevalent, and it's something we need to consider going forwards. It will continue to be important. So each year we also ask respondents about the benefits they experienced as a result of learning. And we know from our previous surveys and from wider evidence that there are a wide range of benefits of learning. These include not just career-related reasons, but also health, social life and community-related benefits. And I think the benefits on the slide just really reflect this. So we had 3 in 10 learners saying that they enjoyed learning more after taking part. We had around 2 in 10 say that they'd improve their social skills, their skills to do their job, or their self-confidence. 16% say they had a recognised qualification. 15% said their health and well-being improved, and 16% said that they were more confident at work. So again, just demonstrating that really broad range of benefits and how we can think about communicating these to future learners. Every year, we also ask about barriers encountered by adults to learning. So we ask this to both adults with recent experience of learning. We ask them what challenges they faced whilst they were learning. And for adults without recent experience of learning, we ask them what barriers have prevented them from doing so. So the top 2 charts on the slide basically show the top 4 barriers for each of these groups. And there are some similarities. So both groups mention work and time pressures. They also mention costs, affordability, and they also mention being put off by tests and exams. The main difference is for adults who don't have recent experience of learning. So that's adults who haven't learned in the last 3 years. Almost 30% say that they felt too old. And if we think back to the findings about who learns and the fact that older adults are less likely to participate in learning, it may be that they are feeling it's kind of too late for them, or there's no reason to do so anymore. We also group the barriers to learning into 2 groups: situational barriers, and these are basically practical barriers or barriers related to people's circumstances. So this could be about transport, for example, affordability, childcare. And then we have dispositional barriers, which are about people's attitudes to learning or their perceptions of learning. And this can include their perceptions of their ability to learn, so that they feel too old, for example, they don't feel confident enough, or they don't feel there's any relevance of learning to them. And when we group these barriers, what we found is that adults with recent experience of learning were more likely to raise situational barriers, so practical barriers, whereas those who haven't learned recently were far more likely to raise these dispositional or attitudinal barriers. And as we've already mentioned, the most common one was that they felt too old to learn. We also found that 3 in 10 adults without recent experience of learning said that there was no reason they hadn't taken part, they just didn't really want to. And so I think what these findings really highlight is the importance of raising the value of learning. We found from our survey and also from wider research that practical barriers are important, and we do need to try and remove these, but these really only start to factor in once people are already interested in learning. So whilst we need to remove these barriers, we also need to promote the benefits of learning so people really understand why it's worth their time and their investment.
Great, thank you very much, Sophie. As Sophie said, that's just some of the highlights from this year's survey, and our report is available on our website. We're going to move on now to Abigail Legoo, who's going to share some of the findings from qualitative research about adults' experiences of learning in lockdown, and particularly online.
Brilliant, thank you, Emily. So yeah, I'll take you through the qualitative findings then. So in terms of the approach that we use, so we conducted 25 qualitative interviews with adult learners, so 10 in Scotland, 10 in Northern Ireland and 5 in Wales. For most interviewees, these took place in December 2020 after last year's participation survey. This is because we wanted to find out about their experiences of learning during the earlier stages of the coronavirus lockdown. Most of these interviewees were survey respondents, and the interviews built on the questions that we asked them in the survey. but some interviewees were referred to us by learning providers, and a couple of the Wales interviews took place in August this year. We adopted the same broad definition of learning that was used in the survey, and the interviews aimed to provide us with a more in-depth understanding about adults' experiences of learning during lockdown and learning online. Similar to the survey, we also explored motivations for learning, benefits of learning, barriers to learning, and future intentions to learn. In addition to this, we also asked learners for their suggestions on how best to support other adults to take up online learning. About the learning then, so as to be expected during the earlier stages of lockdown, most interviewees completed their learning online and from home. The most common online platform used for learning was Zoom. Most adults had started their learning before the first coronavirus lockdown in March 2020, and most of them also had prior experience of learning as an adult. Some had completed courses within the last 12 months. Some interviewees said that their previous learning had influenced their decision to take up learning in lockdown, for example, if they previously enjoyed it or benefited from it. But other interviewees felt that their previous learning did not influence their decision to learn during lockdown. While some learning led to qualifications or was linked to professional development, other learning was done for leisure or personal development, for example, language or drama classes. Learning activities were delivered by a wide range of providers, so similar to what we found in the survey, for example, universities, colleges, employers and community organisations as well. Where adults learned independently, this might have been through things like online reading, TV documentaries or DVD courses, for example. Some learners didn't complete all of their learning activities, so there were instances where the providers had to end the course early due to the impact that lockdown was having on course progression. And some interviewees decided to end their course early if they felt that it was too advanced or uninteresting. Some learning activities that commenced prior to lockdown were already delivered online, for example, Open University and Future Learn courses, but other activities were required to switch to online delivery due to the restrictions. So, for example, the learning that was delivered by community organisations. In terms of motivations for learning, some of these motivations line up with the survey findings and others are additional findings that we found through the interviews. So some interviewees were learning for current or prospective employment, and this was either because the learning was compulsory, they wanted to enhance their skills at work, they wanted to progress within their current role, or they wanted to secure and prepare for employment in the future. Where adults were learning for leisure, some mentioned that they simply had a personal interest in the subject area. And many adults were also learning for more personal benefits or benefits to their well-being. So it was described as an opportunity for enjoyment, socialising and confidence building. And it was a way to keep themselves busy and keep their brains active. Many spoke about their general outlook towards learning as well and why they thought learning was important. So learners typically enjoyed the process of learning and were keen to learn new facts or skills. Lockdown was often described as a trigger to learning, so it had provided adults with the space and the time to be able to take up extra opportunities. And some also said that they wouldn't have been learning through online platforms if the lockdown hadn't happened. Other triggers to learning involved retirement, changes in family circumstances, for example, having fewer childcare responsibilities, and changes in employment circumstances. So, for example, one interviewee couldn't work their usual full-time hours due to homeschooling through lockdown, and so they chose to complete online training courses to justify their hours to their employer. Adults expected to gain many benefits from learning, and they closely matched their initial motivations. So, for example, wanting to learn more about a certain subject area, enhance their working lives, or improve their health and well-being. Most people had already experienced the benefits of learning when we were interviewing them, and some had gained more than they expected due to learning online. For example, some people felt that they could take part in more learning because they could do it from home. And we'll revisit this point on the next slide as well. However, where adults wanted to socialise while they were learning, this didn't happen as much during online learning because it usually involves fewer opportunities to sort of informally chat with other learners before and after the learning takes place. So generally, interviewees described online learning as accessible and convenient. Many learners liked that they could complete online learning activities from the comfort of their own homes, and some liked the fact that online learning removed time and money that would usually be spent on travel. Most interviewees also liked the flexibility of online learning, and some said that it had allowed them to sort of tailor their experiences to suit their own personal style of learning. For example, watching videos or listening to someone read out a passage of online text. Some learners also said that online learning had allowed them to learn at their own pace, and it meant that they could go over information more than once if they wanted to. And some also mentioned that they could learn at a time that suited them and that this worked around other commitments like childcare. Some adults highlighted the variety of choice of learning activities that were available through online platforms. So they were able to sort of access a huge amount of useful information and select from a diverse range of subjects, for example, through Future Learn. Interviewees also liked that online learning had provided them with company and support or something to do, especially during lockdown, and for those that lived alone or felt isolated during this time. Adults also liked that they could communicate with people from all over the world, which wouldn't have been possible if the learning was face-to-face. So in terms of the challenges. So interviewees mainly spoke about their barriers to learning in relation to learning online. Adults said that they often struggled with the technology that was used for online learning. So for instance, if someone couldn't install or use Zoom, or they couldn't connect to the internet, then they were unable to access that learning content. Some adults also didn't initially have access to a computer or a laptop to do this learning. But it is worth noting that although adults initially struggled with the technology, many of them said that they felt more confident as time went on. Many adults said that it was difficult to learn in-depth and complex content on Zoom, and the flow of conversation was often interrupted. So adults also struggled to ask questions quickly and easily in order to clarify their learning. Adults also felt that online learning was more impersonal than face-to-face provision. So generally, adults missed the opportunity for social interaction or making connections with other people who work in their fields. For some adults, their learning was heavily focused on reading online material or sitting through PowerPoints, and they felt that this wasn't a very active way of learning, and they often struggled to digest and retain information this way. Some adults felt that face-to-face provision was more engaging because they could be more productive and kept on task. Overall, adults said that Zoom was a suitable substitute for face-to-face provision. However, it wasn't seen as something that is the equivalent of this. But having said that, many learners did appreciate the chance to learn how to use online platforms such as Zoom, and some said that they would prefer learning to take more of a blended approach in the future. Other challenges towards learning more generally included learners saying that the content was too technical, or that they struggled to fit in learning around full-time employment. So supporting adults to learn online, interviewees made the following suggestions for this. So adults need to be familiar with the technology for online learning, and they also need to have the necessary resources at hand, such as an up-to-date laptop or a fast broadband connection. Adults should be encouraged to explore the variety of options that are available for online learning. So it was emphasised that other adults should try and find a learning activity that works for them or is interesting or fun for them. Highlighting the flexibility of online learning, helping to overcome barriers such as travel, would also be encouraging to other adults. Increased advertising of online learning opportunities would also help, and advertising should be targeted towards adults specifically. It should also inform adults on how to find and apply for learning opportunities, and promote the idea that adults are just as important in the learning process as anybody else. Online courses should also include quizzes throughout them in order to check the understanding of content, and an e-tutor should be made available for adults who might need help or support with online learning, especially if they encounter any technical difficulties. So positively, all interviewees intended to take part in some sort of future learning. Interviewees wanted to continue learning for various reasons, and many of these reflect their motivations that were mentioned earlier on. For instance, many claim that they generally enjoy the process of learning. Some learners also explained that they had enjoyed the learning that they'd done throughout lockdown, and that this motivated them to continue. Some reiterated that learning is an important activity to enhance life experiences, and they wanted to keep their minds active by taking up future opportunities. Others said that they wanted to gain extra qualifications and open up potential employment opportunities, and perhaps in sectors that they'd not thought about as well. Although interviewees did intend to take part in some sort of future learning, they were also asked if anything might prevent them from doing so. Similar to the survey findings, some interviewees said that the cost of learning can be a barrier, and therefore they would need to be in a stable financial position to be able to take up learning, or they would need to seek out cheaper alternatives. Others were concerned about having the time to take up further learning in the future, especially if they felt as though they had more time to learn during lockdown, or if they had other commitments or issues like childcare or ill health. For individuals who were planning to learn for leisure, they said that if they couldn't find activities in a subject of interest to them, that this could also be a barrier. So here are just some quotes just to round off this part of the presentation on why some of the interviewees liked learning and what they got out of learning through lockdown. So we've got, I think, any kind of learning that people can do, they should do. Learning's a great thing. You're never too old to learn, and every day is a learning day. It's opened up a whole new world for me, and with these qualifications, there is the chance now that I could get into employment through it. During COVID, there weren't a lot of positives, and learning's one of the only positives I was able to take out of it, being able to spend some time doing something proactive. Fabulous, thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Abby. We will be making some reports available, just summarising that qualitative research as well. Moving on then now to our panel discussion. So as I said at the start, our research is focused on adult participation in the UK, and we're really keen to place the findings in a broader context of trends in other countries. So pleased now to be joined by Professor Ellen Buren, Derval Lawless and Uwe Gartenschläger to share their reflections on how the findings compare with other countries. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can see each other, and we're not just looking at a PowerPoint slide. There we go. Okay, so just starting off then, I'm interested to know kind of which of the findings from the survey really stand out for you, perhaps surprised you. Uwe, do you want to go first?
I can start. I mean, there is one obvious things which comes along in many places. This is the topic of inequalities in learning and participation, and also the perception of learning, if you like learning or you don't like learning. So this divide in our society is obviously a topic we have for many years already. We have all over Europe, and it's deepening. And I mean, not surprisingly, UNESCO called his last paper on education a new social contract for education. So I think we have to take care, especially about this topic on inequalities. And if I may add one small second thing, I like very much this notion of joy of learning. You had several times in your studies. I think this is crucial to transport this message that learning is joy. And I think there is a close relation between early school leavers and the absence of joy in learning. So if we want to implement lifelong learning and adult education as a place, as a part of lifelong learning, I think we should take care that from the beginning, education and learning is joy. And this is, at least I can say for my country, this is not what school is about. I mean, third of the kids, I think, leave school with thank God it's over. And this will be very difficult for us as adult educators to motivate them later.
Yeah, if I can pick in on here. So I think, Emily, if you asked like what surprises you the most, I think I basically say, sadly, I don't find the results that very surprising, because well, I've been working in this field now for like around 15 years. So 15 years ago, when I started my PhD on participation in adult education, and as a new researcher, when you go into the statistics, it's all about, okay, participation declines by age, there is a social class, social gradient explanation, etc. So that is still very visible in the data, which keeps on underlining that participation in adult education is a hugely unequal subject, and that is really still dominated by this Matthew effect of the ones who already went through education in the past, had successful experiences, keep on learning. So I think basically it really underlines the fact that what we as academics working in this field would distinguish between an accumulation versus a compensation hypothesis. On the one hand, you have already a strong, skill set, etc., and you keep on accumulating, versus you could also see adult education as a way to compensate for earlier learning deficits. I mean, we don't really want to talk about a kind of deficit approach in a kind of negative sense, but that is, frankly speaking, still what it is. I think maybe one of the things I picked up on, the kind of slides, Sophie, that you showed about working status, where there was actually still a fairly big gap, I think, between the unemployed who are seeking for a job and the unemployed who are not seeking for a job. So I think you said 45% of the unemployed who are seeking and 23% for the unemployed who are not seeking, which does indicate there is something happening about an active labor market policy that is in place here. But I think a bit, as Uwe said, for me, increasingly, throughout my career, I'm also way more convinced about, it's really lifelong learning from cradle to grave. And we really need to kickstart the positive experiences in the compulsory education system. Because if we see that so many people who've never ever learned after leaving compulsory education, well, then that's probably also a result of a kind of, negative attitudes or lack of motivation they've developed in their younger years. I think one comment I would like to make, it seemed there wasn't a specific slide on gender, if I remember correctly. So, I mean, it might actually also be interested to unpack the gender dimension a bit more, because we actually know from, adult education survey, PIAC data, that there's actually women in the participation rate start overtaking the men. But if you then break it down by things like barriers, reasons, motivation to participate, you still see that the men still participate more because of work-related reasons, and that the barriers for women are still more the kind of family, household combination of, you know, caring for kids, etc., remains important.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think just to come back on your point about gender, so that's in the report, but what we see there is kind of relatively equal participation, but I think there's something to look at in terms of intersectionality and looking at gender in relation to other characteristics, but also looking at different motivations, different barriers too. Thanks, Ellen. Devil.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. I think for me, what I was going to come in on is really about what stands out for me. And it probably follows on to what Ellen said. It's about that breakdown of the motivations to learn, which I think is really nicely put in the research in terms of the different categories that you have. And I saw that there was an increase in learning and knowledge and personal and social motivations to learn, with 36% as to develop myself as a person, which I think is fantastic to see. And I'd love to see, as Ellen said, the breakdown of that in terms of gender as well, but I know that there is more details on that in the report. And for me, it really reaffirms our commitment to non-formal education and to learning for life focused programs. Like, they're what builds self-esteem. They help people to engage in society, to feel comfortable in themselves, maybe to question their circumstances, and also to practice self-advocacy, which I think is really important for many of the marginalized and vulnerable groups that we can see engage in education at the lower levels. And I think an aspect of that is about the fear that many of those people have of government services, social workers, formal education institutions. They've had negative experiences in the past. They may have been mistreated, or family or friends were mistreated. And understandably, they have that fear and that disconnect from those services. So I think seeing adult education as that intervention piece where people build their self-esteem and they feel more comfortable to question, it helps people to stand up for themselves, but then also to move forward to that next phase where they work together as a community and they create that social change, which I think is why we're always so focused on change-oriented adult learning as well, as a really positive step. And it's great to see that the research that's being done captures that, because I think a lot of that has been lost in recent times too. And I suppose particularly thinking of those marginalized groups in the pandemic too, and looking at, say, social media, where people are being taken advantage of and targeted with false information about, say, vaccines, and other specific maybe political issues at the moment, that it is great to see that people are coming to education because they have a motivation for a topic, or they're looking at personal development. Because in my, I suppose, understanding would be that, you know, if you get that first point, then people will move towards the employment, but it really is about building someone's self-esteem first and foremost. Great,
thank you. So some really great points there, and I think you're absolutely right, Ellen, that these are trends that that we've seen time and time again through the survey and other evidence too. So what do you think the implications are for policy and practice? What do we need to be doing to support more adults to take up learning? And I think particularly those groups who are missing out, because otherwise, thinking about that kind of accumulation and those who've benefited before continuing to take part, then actually we could end up reinforcing inequalities through adult learning rather than addressing them. So what do you think we need to be doing kind of in policy and practice to get more adults into learning?
Well, if I can start answering this question. So I think, as we already focused on, you know, providing a positive learning experience for more people in initial education, I think that really should be like a top priority. But I think also sometimes it's a matter of the outreach, because I think, Sophie, in your slide, you talked about the distinction between the situational and the dispositional barriers. But if we go to the kind of classic literature on barriers, like, for example, in the 1981 book by Patricia Cross, where she also focused on institutional barriers. So, of course, we need to always think in these kind of surveys, and that's the same with PIAC survey, adult education survey. These are individual level surveys. But actually, if you want to, get someone into participation, there needs to be a positive match between the individual needs and what the learning providers have to offer. because if what they want is not available for them, then there won't be like this match. So sometimes actually, you know, later in the 1980s, someone basically said, well, on top of this kind of situational, dispositional, institutional barriers, the institutional barrier needs to be supplemented by an informational barrier, because some people just don't learn because they don't know what is on offer for them. So those are a couple of things that we definitely could do, but I think also focusing on the benefits. And I think, you know, both Abby and Sophie made really good points on how can we communicate the benefits better to potential learners. Now, one of the kind of key ways to explain why people do or do not participate, if you take it from a more kind of economic perspective, economists would say it's a cost-benefit analysis. You put in costs in terms of money and tuition fees that you need to pay, etc., or registration fee, but also there is a time cost. The time you spend on participation, you cannot spend on something else. So there's an indirect cost there as well. Now, you could actually say that whenever we do this kind of qualitative type of research, we usually see that people were happy that they participated and recognized the benefits. But this might actually be the result of the fact that their cost-benefit analysis at the very start was already positive. They did participate because they were fairly sure about the benefits. What about the people who are not very sure about the benefits, and how can we make those benefits more visible to them, more tangible for them, more realistic for them? Because as long as we're not going to be able to do that, I think it's going to remain difficult.
Absolutely. Great.
Yeah, if I may add to something, not to repeat what was said, what I totally subscribe to, but maybe this is a continental European view. I think we have to challenge also government and the state to be duty barriers for adult learning and education. I recently talked to a headmaster of a community learning center here, and she said, we are losing the lower middle class people. It's about affordability. I mean, you mentioned it in the survey on that the cost is quite high on the percentage as an argument not to participate. So if we leave this all to the market and the government doesn't take care about this sector of the lifelong learning education, then we come into trouble on this side as well. This is on top of what was said, but I think we should challenge our governments that they should take care and they should fund sustainable, not always in short-term projects only, adult learning and education. And on top, I think we are confronted now with a new challenge. This is the move to more and more online learning, which will not disappear after the pandemic. I'm quite sure about this, but this needs huge investment into equipment, into training of adult educators, material development, and so forth. So I think on top of everything what was said, and if you ask about the political dimension, this is a political dimension where the state also has to fulfill its duty, and this is something we cannot see in too many European countries at the full size.
Yeah, absolutely. Devil, is there anything else that you think should be done?
Yeah, Emily, I suppose I really agree with both what Ellen and Uwe have said. I think they're really strong points, especially around that promoting the benefits piece and addressing the current needs of the learners and who we're missing out on at the moment. And I think 2 points. One is that it's really vital to keep undertaking this research. I think we've seen during the pandemic that many governments weren't collecting data on learners. And if anything, that's kind of hiding the situation, and you can't address something unless you actually know what's going on the ground. So it's great to keep doing that. And I think the importance of qualitative data for that as well. The disparity between the social classes was mentioned by both Sophie and Abby, and I think that's a hugely important issue, and it's something that keeps growing. And we're failing people if this continues. I think we can come out with as many detailed strategies and policies and excellent programs, but if they're not actually reaching the people that we intend to support, we're continuing to fail. So I think it's about maybe moving our attitude and our perspective towards more learner-centered programs, as my colleagues have said, and then also thinking about maybe not about people being hard to reach, but about the people who are seldom heard. And I know that that's a concept that I've heard before in research that's really valuable. And I suppose just general activities, you know, building on what Ellen said as well about the outreach, thinking about the flexible learning that's important, and also that risk piece, financial incentives. You know, sometimes people think that providing a small financial incentive, that's enough. But if you have childcare to take into consideration, if you're leaving a job, you're making a massive time commitment, then you also have study to take into account. And then after that program where you've put your life maybe on hold, as far as the person could be concerned about for a year or even longer, 3 or 4 years, they're not often sure that there will be a job at the end of that, because they quite often don't have the social connections to be able to access employment. So it's really about taking away the risk factors for those people. And as Ellen has said, promoting the benefits there as well, but acknowledging the fact that it's a huge step for many people to return to education. So I think policy needs to be more enforceable with specific actions that, you know, provide interventions that are accessible for people, especially for those from lower socioeconomic conditions.
Great. Thank you. And a final question. So we've obviously heard about kind of online learning that people have undertaken during lockdown, and that's kind of really accelerated a trend that existed previously. What lessons do you think we can take from learning during the pandemic into future delivery of adult learning, including any examples that you're aware of that kind of highlight the best approach and perhaps that we can learn from for future?
Yeah, I probably find this the most difficult question you've asked so far, because we don't have like a crystal ball, of course, to look into the future. But I think one of the main concerns actually relates to the same thing of inequality. Like, what about people who are not very kind of, I mean, for example, as a university professor, last year we had to kind of change into online mode of delivery. And, you know, even if I kind of call myself fairly digitally skilled, you know, you kind of need to spend time in getting used to all these new platforms that you're using, etc. So, you know, as a highly educated person, I kind of feel the efforts that I need to do. So, you know, it's gonna be difficult to have people immediately learning from scratch in a kind of self-directed way on their own if there isn't like adequate support available. So I think there again, there needs to be some sort of form of outreach that needs to keep on going strong through probably alternative ways.
If I may come in next, yeah, what I said in my previous statement already is still valid. It needs now a lot of investment. It is a different kind of learning on all levels, and this can be provided on a good quality only with a lot of investments from different kind of stakeholders. But what I want to add as well is that it provides also some conceptual questions, and one of it is, what is a community? In the old non-digital world, community were the people who live in one place. Now community is a totally different thing, and this is good and bad at the same time. For example, our colleague from Turkey, she reported that she's doing civic education trainings, which is of course not easy in Turkey, but all of a sudden she has participants from Berlin, from Paris, from the faraway village in Anatolia, whereas before it was all from the Istanbul part of the city. So it's a new kind of, this is good, but at the same time, of course, we have this problem that like-minded people meet in their bubbles, and the interaction between the different kind of groups in society can suffer. And this I define, I think this is one of the main tasks of adult learning as well, bringing people together, organizing exchange, discussions on the local level, on what level ever. And so I think this is one aspect I have in mind. I'm sure there are more on online. So it is not only on transferring the same we did before into the online learning, but it changes the whole environment and setting. And as Ellen said, we are just in the beginning. We cannot know what will happen, but it will be quite substantial, I think.
Yeah. I completely agree with what Uwe said, and I'm even remembering my own experiences in an adult education program. And I loved the diversity in that group. There was people of all ages, different backgrounds, and it's really important to have that because it does make people step out of their comfort zone and think about themselves. And you learn and you grow in your own identity as well as the content of the course that you're learning from. And I think that's where the adult education transformative piece comes in. And it's much harder to do that online. It's very difficult for people to engage, especially for people who maybe have lower levels of literacy and of course lower levels of digital literacy. And I think that moves to another point that we must now think of access to equipment and digital literacy as core requirements for adult learning. And that has to be given to support people. They can't engage in adult learning unless they're given appropriate equipment and the space and support to be able to advance their digital skills. And I think even as Ellen said as well, also for tutors, we found in our research in Ireland that there was a huge number of learners who struggled to engage, not only because of their own digital skills, which they did improve during the pandemic, but also because their educators, unfortunately, didn't have the capacity to be able to deliver programs online. Some learners reported that they weren't able to get into their Zoom class because the person delivering it didn't know that they were waiting in the waiting room. And they were literally just sitting there. It's awful to think about that. So I think that's something that needs to now become also a core requirement for educators in their education training themselves as part of their professional development. Another point that I think is really interesting too is that, I know, for example, in Ireland in the tertiary education sector, which includes literacy, adult, vocational education and higher education, the pandemic was one of the first times where people really truly collaborated completely across the sector because they had to. And I think it's a lesson to be learned that we all need to step up and work together more closely and acknowledge the fact that all the segments of the sector are completely important to be able to support a lifelong learning approach. And within that, also rapid changes are possible from a policy level and a government perspective. Quite often we'd see a change coming and it might take 5 years, it might take 10 years. And I understand that there's always complications, and especially now during the pandemic, haven't seen more of that from the other side. But when changes are needed, they were able to step up and create them rapidly. So I think we should be holding our policymakers and our government more accountable to that when they needed to step up and create policy changes, they did do that. They did provide funding for different learners. They did provide funding for institutions, and they acknowledged the fact that there was an urgent issue. Learners from lower socioeconomic groups having a low educational attainment is also an urgent issue, and it should be addressed in the same way. It's not good enough just to think, well, it's improved by 2% or 4% in the last 10 years. That's a failure in the system. So I think it's really holding those people accountable to supporting our learners and seeing that as an urgent issue, in my mind, would be fantastic. But we've learned a lot, I think, from the pandemic. It's obviously caused a huge disruption. And I joke, but only because out of the concern that I've had for it and how awful it's been for so many learners. But I think we've also learned from it, and we've seen how important flexible learning is, and that supports many groups, particularly people who might have disabilities, and also perhaps maybe people who are parenting independently as well as lone parents, being able to have that flexibility to go and drop the kids to school, or to be able to support someone if there's an issue at home. So there's some benefits as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, we know from all of the research how important it is to have flexible opportunities for adults. And I think it's amazing kind of what we've seen during the pandemic about how we can get that where we didn't think it was possible, or were told it wasn't possible before, but actually we've seen it out of necessity. So yeah, great. Well, that brings us to the end of the session. Thank you very much to you all for taking part. That's been really great. Thank you very much.